I want to start things off with what is quite possibly my favorite photo. It's the image of Neil Armstrong in the lunar module smiling at the camera being held by Buzz Aldrin and having just spent 2 hours and 36 minutes walking on the moon. He's visibly fatigued and his eyes are red and glassy. Though it could be from being tired, his teary expression is probably due to the fact that he and his crew had just completed one of the single most difficult missions ever attempted by human beings. Though the moonwalk was completed, they still had to leave the moon and get home. If you look up Neil Armstrong in lunar module, you can see the photo I'm talking about. It was taken on July 20th, 1969. Though it appears as though Armstrong is sitting down, this isn't the case. The lunar module had to be light enough to lift off from the moon once their mission was complete. This meant they had to do away with any extraneous components. So there were no seats. In fact, the controls seen behind Armstrong rested upon a hull thin enough that it could be punctured by a screwdriver pressed against it. Armstrong is in his spacesuit. The American flag patch can be seen on his shoulder. His helmet is off, but his communications carrier is still on. With its black and white paneling, it's also known as a Snoopy cap for its resemblance to the famous Peanuts cartoon character. This cap was worn during launch in the lunar module and on the lunar surface. It fastened under the chin and had an elastic center portion. The Teflon fabric sides held the communications equipment and mouthpiece, which can also be seen in the photo. Armstrong has a little tuft of hair spilling out from the top of that Snoopy cap, further accentuating his disheveled appearance. Though he seems exhausted, the smile and gleam in his eyes speaks of just how much he knows what a momentous occasion this is. Books have been written on the importance of the Apollo 11 moon mission. Yes, it put an end to the space race. Yes, it put the first man on the moon. I'm sure all of this was going through his mind, but there's one thing that not a lot of people know about or have considered about this mission. We can look back on it now and see it as a success for what it was. And how could it have happened any other way? Right now, from where we are, we already know that the crew of Apollo 11 got home safely. But in 1969, for those men and their wives, some 238,000 miles back home, didn't know for sure how things would play out. When the press asked one of the astronauts' wives what they planned on doing when he got back home from the moon, she coyly responded that they didn't really have plans. This is true. They specifically didn't make plans for a heroic return because there was a very real possibility that they would not be returning home. Just a year before, on May 6, 1968, Armstrong, then a backup commander for the Apollo 9 mission, took off on a simulated lunar landing mission at Ellington Air Force Base. It was his 22nd flight for the test vehicle. But after just 5 minutes of being airborne, he suddenly lost control of the vehicle. Armstrong ended up having to eject from the module about 200 feet up. He parachuted to safety, but the LLRV crashed and burned on impact. Investigations determined there was a loss of helium pressure resulting in a depletion of hydrogen peroxide used for the reserve attitude thrusters. The vehicle's instruments didn't warn of such a failure. Compound that with the memory of Apollo 1 still fresh in everyone's minds. It was on February 21st, 1967 that the crew of Apollo 1 experienced a cabin fire during launch rehearsal, resulting in the death of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. An Apollo 1 mission patch was left on the moon's surface after the crew of Apollo 11 finished the first ever moonwalk. So that smile on Armstrong's face while in the lunar module has a lot behind it. I would say, or I could at least imagine, that the enormity of the situation would outweigh all others. The fact that he and his partner Buzz Aldrin had just done the seemingly impossible, they had left planet Earth and successfully explored another world. It took the crew of Apollo 11 76 hours to get to the moon. Once they arrived, they separated from the command module, leaving Michael Collins behind, and began a 2-hour descent to the lunar surface. Some people have questioned how there could have been video feed from the surface of the moon as Armstrong first exited the lunar module. Well, there was actually a television camera attached to the lunar module, which was started up by pulling an attached wire from inside. As it turns out, these early photos of Armstrong on the surface would be some of the very few ever taken of him while on the moon. The vast majority of the pictures would be of Buzz Aldrin and taken by Armstrong himself. There are a few times, about 4 actually, where you can see the reflection of Armstrong in the visor of Aldrin's helmet. So the question is, would you like to be the first person on the moon or the person most photographed on the moon? After all, it's kind of like going on vacation, getting back to develop all the pictures you took and realizing you're only in about 2 of them. Speaking of pictures, Apollo 11 marked not only the first man on the moon, but the first camera on the moon as well. Hasselblad was the maker of the camera that documented the historic moon landing. NASA and Hasselblad had begun working together in 1962 during the Mercury program, 7 years before the moon mission. NASA needed a camera that could function properly, reliably, and in the intense cold temperatures and decreased gravity in space. To prepare for this mission in space, Hasselblad had to make some changes to their cameras. They removed a number of elements to reduce the overall weight: the leather covering, the auxiliary shutter, reflex mirror, and even the viewfinder. However, they did implement a custom film magazine to carry enough film for 70 frames as opposed to the usual 12. On top of that, the cameras were painted matte black to minimize reflections from the window of the orbiter. The camera that captured the first images of the moon and from the moon was a Hasselblad data camera with a Zeiss Biogon 60mm f5.6 lens and a 70mm film magazine. There was also a Hasselblad electric camera with a Zeiss planar 80mm f2.8 lens. The HDC camera included a plate which was imprinted with fixed cross marks on the negatives. This allowed for photogrammetric measurements to be made from the images. Armstrong shot all of these photos from the moon landing with the HDC attached to the chest of his spacesuit. After all of their experiments, photos, and scheduled tasks were complete, they had to leave the cameras and lenses behind. Of course, they kept the film, but in order to successfully leave the moon, they had to be mindful of the very strict weight requirements. All ancillary objects had to be tossed. The items left behind on the moon amounted to about $1 million. Today, there are still 12 Hasselblad bodies and lenses on the surface of the moon.
Proceeded 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. Excellent.
After returning home from the moon, the astronauts went through customs declaring moon rocks and lunar samples. They were then brought into quarantine for 3 weeks to ensure they didn't bring back any strange moon diseases or germs. Neil Armstrong died on August 25, 2012 after developing complications from bypass surgery to relieve coronary artery disease. He was 82 years old. In his passing, President Barack Obama issued this statement: "Neil was among the greatest of American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time. When he and his fellow crew members lifted off aboard Apollo 11 in 1969, they carried with them the aspirations of an entire nation. They set out to show the world that the American spirit can see beyond what seems unimaginable, that with enough drive and ingenuity, anything is possible. And when Neil stepped foot on the surface of the moon for the first time, he delivered a moment of human achievement that will never be forgotten. Today, Neil's spirit of discovery lives on in all the men and women who have devoted their lives to exploring the unknown, including those who are ensuring that we reach higher and go further in space. That legacy will endure, sparked by a man who taught us the enormous power of one small step.